Good morning, good day, good evening from wherever you are around the world, and thank you for joining us for this ISTQB webinar on test automation strategy. Hello, I'm Andrew Polner, the product owner for the ISTQB test automation portfolio, and I'm looking forward to telling you about this new syllabus that we've recently introduced and explaining some of the details of what it contains. Looking forward to your comments. Please go ahead and post those so we can answer those in the Q&A session at the end. So let's go ahead and talk about test automation strategy, version 1.0. So a little bit of background as to how test automation strategy came to be. I believe you're all familiar with the test automation engineer syllabus that was introduced in 2016. That was also just recently updated. So when we were actually working to look at the update to the 2016 test automation engineer syllabus, we realized and recognized that there's a lot of areas that could really use some additional expansion to the body of knowledge on test automation. We ended up recognizing that some of those were more strategic in nature as opposed to engineering in nature. And as a result, we realized that it made sense to actually create a second syllabus to expand the overall body of knowledge for test automation. So today we have a new syllabus for the ISTQB portfolio called Test Automation Strategy. That syllabus is part of the specialist group, specialist stream, and we will talk about that particular syllabus and what it contains so you can get a better idea of what that is. So let's talk a little bit about test automation strategy. So when we talk about strategy, first of all, we want to recognize that test automation is a very strong and important topic as part of test automation. ISTQB has done multiple surveys that bear that out, as well as there's many industry surveys that show test automation is something that's extremely important for the test organization. The differences between what we've seen previously back when we developed the original syllabus and what we're seeing today and in the last many years is that there's a lot of solutions that already exist in the test automation space, which we'll talk about a little later. Those solutions can be open source tools, commercial tools, and what's important now in most organizations is not as much to try to build something from scratch as it is to identify the right solution that meets the need for your organization. And in doing so, making sure that those solutions can be integrated into other tools that you are using for your software development tools. So as we move from a traditional waterfall style of software development to more agile techniques and eventually adopting DevOps or DevSecOps to help automate the processes, we find that the automation itself needs to fit in within that new paradigm of software development. So those are some of the challenges that we are seeing, and we're getting feedback from industry on what people are doing with automated tools these days. And finally, one of the areas that is very important is, how do you transition from an environment where maybe you're doing manual tests to getting to the next step of starting some automation? And then how do you get from automation to the ultimate step of continuous testing, where you're testing on a regular basis, early and often, and throughout the cycle and even beyond deployment, so that you're able to really assess the quality of your application throughout the life cycle. So we'll talk a little bit about the content for this new syllabus. So there's some new areas that we talk about here. One of them is about cost and risk to different approaches that we can use for implementing automation. So if we kind of take the approach of developing things in-house, which a lot of organizations do, there's obviously the cost of doing that, and you need to have the technical expertise, the ability to support those solutions. So we discuss that in the syllabus as one of the options, but also kind of lay out some of the risks there. There's obviously the source, the traditional source of tools, the vendors. We have multiple vendors that support multiple tools, and there's an ever-growing list of vendors that support those tools. So working with a vendor means getting a solution that's pre-built, that you then adapt to your particular project, and where necessary, you have the vendor for reach back on technical issues. So that's always a nice solution. And then the last solution that we talk about is the outsource solution, where maybe your team doesn't have the technical expertise to build out the automation, but you have the domain and the knowledge of your application functionality, so you can outsource the actual automation. And that has certain benefits in that a number of the outsourced organizations may offer a lower labor cost in terms of being able to do that work for you. But then the trade-off is that you need to really make sure that they understand what your application does, what you need to have automated, and make sure that that all works. So again, there's no right or wrong approach. We just kind of discuss and describe the different approaches and kind of what some of the costs or potential risks may be associated with that. Next, we talk a little more about the different models for tools and the licensing. This is important as it applies both operationally in terms of how you use the tools, and there's also costs associated with this for the long term of using the tools or technology. So I have a discussion around open source tools. Open source, people think of as free tools, and technically they're available for free download, but like any tool, you need to understand how to use the tools and get some training, maybe even some consulting services to help you implement those solutions. So while open source tools have evolved and become stronger, more feature filled over the years, it is important to note that there is a learning curve associated with using them. That's important to kind of factor into your overall test automation strategy. There are also, for commercial tools, those are licensed in different ways. The traditional licensing model is where you essentially buy a license for a user, and that user typically would be someone's machine or computer that they do the automation on. So it's, per node, as it's sometimes called. And a variation of that is where you can have multiple people having the tool installed on their computer, and then it becomes a floating license. So let's say that you have a team of 10 people, they all have the tool installed, but you've only purchased, let's say, 5 floating licenses. So only 5 people at any given time could use the tool. That's what the floating model is, and we discussed that. And finally, we have the runtime licenses that we talk a little bit about, and those are for execution only. So for large projects where you have a lot of execution that needs to go, there are execution licenses, and primarily those are designed to lower the cost of the tool from a development and execution tool to only an execution tool. We also talk about how automation changes depending on what software development lifecycle methodology your organization is currently employing. So if you're doing waterfall, legacy, we talk about, how to best implement automation. If you've kind of moved over to agile, we describe that. And then of course, if you're now looking at more advanced pipeline automation, we talk about the integration of automation within those environments. There's a discussion around shift left and shift right. Those are concepts that also apply to test automation, where clearly we want to shift left in terms of making sure that we get automation on the project earlier. The earlier the better. It allows us to gain quick feedback on the quality of our application. But also shift right is a technique that says, even once you deploy the software, you may want to continue running tests to make sure that operationally in a user context, the application is behaving in a manner that that's suitable and effective for the users. We talk about data. Data is obviously very important in terms of automation. The data that you need to define, the APIs, the application programming interfaces that you may need to interact with. Your automation might need to be able to make calls to those APIs and access to databases to be able to get the data that you use for testing. So really understanding all those parameters is an area that we get into, which is very important on a strategic level, to make sure that we're really thinking not just about the automation solution, but kind of holistically how that automation solution needs to act and interact within the larger environment. And we talk about test automation distributions in terms of where you would want to automate testing. We will cover that a little bit later in more detail. And finally, characteristics for optimal implementation. So how do we make sure that what we have as a great solution is implemented in an optimal manner? So we have a discussion around the stakeholders. Who are the people that are going to benefit from the test automation? That's a very important component because those are essentially the consumers of the automation. So we talk about that, talk about the potential for multiple platforms, multiple approaches in terms of where automation needs to reside and the implications of that. And we also cover potential compliance issues depending on the system and the software that you're actually testing and doing automation for. There may be some compliance issues. There may be things you can and cannot do with your automation. Potentially those could include, storing static data, things of that nature. So we do talk about that, make you aware of that. In terms of expanded content, and by expanded, I'm talking about expanded from the original Test Automation Engineer syllabus, we have a number of additional discussions around deployment strategies where we get more into the different environments and what you want to do with those different environments. We talk a little bit about tools, how to make sure we have the right tools in the right environments. There's a discussion around the system under test. What is it that we need to have available and ready when we have our automation solution deployed? The data element that I talked about just briefly, very important. And then, of course, all the artifacts that we develop as part of our test automation solution, those need to be under CM or configuration management. We need to make sure that from one release to another, nothing gets lost, everything continues to work. If for some reason the automation doesn't work with the next release, we should be able to revert back to the prior release of automation, make sure that everything is accounted for. We also have a discussion around deployment risks, okay? And those can happen on a technical front. There's, technical issues which could be that the code itself for automation is not clearly written and is hard to maintain. And by being hard to maintain means that errors can be introduced into the automation code. So we need to have those kinds of considerations. But there are also project risks, right? What happens if the environment itself for the SUT, the test environment, it has not been stood up in time? Now we don't have the ability to run any tests. Or what happens when there's delays? How does that affect our test automation? And then there's, particular failure points that can happen along the way in any number of different circumstances. So dependencies is a really important topic with automation. There's kind of internal dependencies within the test automation solution, the data, the interfaces, the functions, etc., that are built in. But we also have dependencies outside to the overall infrastructure. So when we have the automated solution and we need to communicate with other applications, with the system under test, with the database, we need to make sure that those dependencies are well thought through, well defined, and well tested in the automation solution. ROI, or return on investment, is always something that organizations are looking at. We talk about the characteristics of ROI and the different metrics that you need to think about in terms of cost savings that automation can produce. But we also need to consider the investment that we need to have in test automation. So ultimately, creating test automation needs to show value to the organization. And by showing value, you can show a good return on the actual project for test automation. Then we also expand the scope on the viability of test automation. When is test automation, the right choice? When is it suitable to use test automation? And what are the different challenges that automation can address or maybe cannot address? So the challenges is kind of twofold. There's certain tests that maybe can only be run with automation because of their complexity. Correspondingly, there are tests that potentially cannot use automation because of the randomness of when those tests occur, the length of the test, or any number of other factors that we talk about. So it's important to really make sure that you apply test automation to the right scenarios so you have effectiveness and suitability of the tools. And then we talk about the transitioning. How do we transition from a manual test environment to an automated environment? What are the costs associated with that? What's the staffing required for that? What are some of the dependencies and overlap that we find as we go from manual to automated? And what are some of the differences potentially between automated and manual? And then once we have our automated test solution, how do we take the next step, which is to a more continuous testing environment? And that is typically most often done with DevOps or DevSecOps, where you have what are called pipelines, essentially environments, orchestration environments that allow you to execute those tests as part of activity throughout your software development lifecycle. So what are the appropriate things to do to make sure that your test automation solution can fit within those pipelines and can be executed automatically after the build, as you move from one environment to another, from, let's say, a development environment to test environment, from test to a pre-production environment, and from production to pre-production to a production final environment. So all those things are discussed. Going to talk a little bit about the test automation distributions that I alluded to earlier. So this is a nice graphic that we have in test automation strategy. And you may be familiar with the work from a fellow by the name of Mike Cohn. he developed what is called the test automation pyramid. If you look on the very left, the first diagram is the test automation pyramid. And what that shows is at 3 levels of testing: unit level or component level at the bottom, service testing or API testing kind of in the middle, and then your user interface UI testing at the top. The advice from Mike Cohn that's been readily accepted and adopted for many years by folks in test automation is that it makes the most sense where possible to automate as much as you can at the lowest level, unit and component testing, and then to automate some amount at the service testing level, and then finally have some automation at the user interface, but not focus all of the efforts there. Now that's great if you are developing the software from scratch and you have the ability to do that, but that's not always the case. So with these diagrams, what we're doing is making you aware that there's other distributions that may apply to what you're doing, and there's kind of some pros and cons to each of them. So if we look at the next one, is what we call the ice cone shapes, like an ice cream cone. And in this distribution, there's very little unit testing, some amount of service testing, and then more UI testing. So why would you use this distribution? Well, it may be that you don't actually control the actual code itself. Maybe it's a third-party product that you're integrating into your solution. So there's little testing that you can do at the unit or component level, and maybe your focus starts really more at the integration level where you're doing service testing and API testing. And then because of that, you are able to do an expanded set of tests at the user interface. Now, we also know that the more you test later in the process, the higher the cost is for any defects that you find. Because clearly, if the application has gone all the way through to user acceptance testing through the UI, if a defect is found, it has to go all the way back to the developer for them to make that fix, and then start again the process at the unit component level, service testing, etc. So it ends up costing more, unfortunately. But as I said, I'm not trying to say one approach is good and another one is bad. Often it's what you're able to do within your particular environment. So that's what the ice cone shape is all about. The hourglass shape strategy is really one where, again, you have now access to the code base. You're able to do your unit and component tests, but you choose not to do much on the service testing. And then again, the focus comes back when you're doing your UI testing. So this is a strategy that we actually find quite often in industry because the emphasis, the ability to test at the unit level, it's kind of well known and understood. And the ability to test at the user interface, kind of more the functionality from the end user perspective, that's also very well understood. What's sometimes not as well understood is how do you do that middle layer? How do you do the service testing? How do you make sure that the API calls, the services that you're calling are working properly, that the data is formatted for them, that any kind of potential delays in data don't affect the service from being actually executed and provide you the right results. So this particular strategy is one that we would recommend. If you are using this strategy, you probably want to focus a little bit more on the mid-tier, on the service testing, and expand that out just to make sure that you know, you're not missing something that could then affect your UI testing strategy later. And finally, we have what we call the umbrella shaped strategy. And that one is one where clearly all the automation is being done at the user interface level, at the UI or the graphical user interface. And those strategies are typically when you really don't have access to either the the code base for the unit, component testing, or you don't have the ability to exercise the services and the APIs. So really, the only choice you do have is to test at the UI, which certainly is a great choice, and it's a better choice than not testing at all. So we highly recommend that you kind of look at your test strategies, look at the syllabus for what we talk about, what we recommend, and hopefully this will give you some guidance on how to move forward. So we've expanded the body of knowledge for test automation. We did that initially by updating the software, the test automation engineer syllabus. And that, of course, focuses on the development of sustainable automation solutions and understanding kind of what the technical requirements are to develop those. So that's the engineering part. And what we talked about today is really the strategic part. And strategy focuses on really taking that successful solution, but making sure that it's implemented correctly within and across an organization. So as a result of that, what we have is 2 syllabi now. The Test Automation Engineering Syllabus version 2.0, which is the update to Test Automation Engineer from 2016, and Test Automation Strategy, which is what we've been talking about today. So to conclude, we find that TAS, or Test Automation Strategy version 1.0, recognizes that you need to start out with a good automation solution. However, you also need to be effective at how you implement that solution so that you have value and effectiveness provided to your organization. So with that, we have the new Test Automation Strategy version 1.0, helps fill some of those gaps and expand the body of knowledge that ISTQB continues to work on. And we will move now to the Q&A session. So thank you, and look forward to answering your questions. Okay, the first question is, does Test Automation Strategy replace the Test Automation Engineer syllabus? No, it does not. It actually expands the scope of test automation now over 2 syllabi. So if you have taken Test Automation Engineer previously, the Test Automation Strategy will expand your knowledge in the area of strategy-related topics for test automation. Why are there 2 syllabi on test automation? As I stated earlier, when the working group was looking at updating the 2016 Test Automation Engineer syllabus, we realized and recognized that there were a lot of topics that we could add, we could expand on from the original syllabus. And in doing so, it became very clear that by expanding those topics, we really had 2 different areas. We had the engineering of test automation, and we had topics around strategic implementation of test automation. And that's why the names now reflect those 2 areas. Any additional questions? The question is, where can we find the information? So if you go to istqb.org and you click at the very top on certifications and you scroll down to specialist, there will be a card there for the Test Automation Strategy that you can click on that card, and it gives you all the details of the syllabus as well as all the downloads, the syllabus itself, the sample exam question, and other artifacts that are part of the release. So again, to conclude, we have the 2 syllabi that essentially broaden the scope of test automation. They are not dependent on one another. That's important to note. So if you are interested more in the engineering aspects of test automation, go ahead and study and get certified in test automation engineering. However, if you're more interested in the strategic aspects of implementing test automation, go ahead and look at test automation strategy. If you're looking to kind of broaden your horizons on the entire topic of test automation, you may also be interested in looking at both of them. So that concludes our presentation, and we appreciate you joining us. Oh, we have one more question. The question is how test automation should evolve with AI. That is a great question. There are a number of tools that have come out recently that claim to either use AI for testing or that have AI built into them to help generate test cases. The scope of the current syllabi that have been released do not currently include those, but those are great topics, and I think over the years, as the market matures and there's greater clarity on what the effects of AI are on test automation, that would be a topic for us to add into a future release of one or the other syllabus. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate the questions, very good questions. And again, all the information that I talked about, all the files are available at ISTQB.org. Look forward to having you have a successful journey in test automation.